Hey, it's Max. This is Melbourne's worst train made with Lego. Well, no, but in all seriousness, here's the real deal. It's been a long 2 years since I designed my Extrapolis 100, and with the Siemens Nexas, I've finally completed the trinity of what I would call the classic mid-2010s Melbourne suburban rolling stock, along with the Commingers. But a few things to clear up. Firstly, why is it Melbourne's worst train? Well, it's quite obvious really, it looks bad, end of argument. And secondly, the proper version of this mock does not currently exist in real life, and these are all renders made using Bricklink Studio. With that out of the way, let's get into the good stuff. I've made many accidental Siemens in the past, partly because they're literally just a box, but ever since my Extrapolis 100, I knew that I wanted to make one for real. The Siemens, being the early 2000s cheap crap that they are, consists of a very modular design, being a part of the Siemens modular metro range and all. This means that each window and door is a modular segment, and every carriage is made up of predetermined and approximately evenly spaced panels. As with most of my mocks, it started out as a rough outline of the dimensions of the T-car, which as usual I immediately disregarded as I tried my best to plan out the window and door spacing. In my first draft, I made each segment 7 studs long. I laid out this draft all the way back in September of 2023, however it wasn't until around August the next year that I did anything further. When I returned, I immediately shortened each window segment to 6 studs while keeping the doors at 7, and added an extra stud at each end of the carriage. After this slight redesign, I started to find windows to fit the dimensions I laid out. Up until this point, I had intentionally designed my other realistic train mocks to use one transparent piece per window, often a panel. I think that using one piece per window looks a lot cleaner because there aren't any seams. However, for the Siemens this is not possible because Lego doesn't make any windows with the dimensions I required. Instead, I settled for 2 1x4 bricks topped by a 1x4 tile, although I would have loved to make it out of 1x4x2 panels and 1x4 plates. Those are big holes in the transparent panel department. The death of Lego's single best colour, transparent brown, aside, I started work on what was the first of many difficult challenges I had to overcome, the doors. Considering that I had allocated 7 studs for the width of the doors, the only reasonable way I could think to make them was with a snot, studs not on top construction. Odd width snot builds are almost always a pain, because you need to make up an extra half plate to keep it in line with the stud grid. After prototyping for a while, I landed on a door design that consisted of 2 door sections, each 7 plates wide and 7 studs tall, so many 7s, with an extra plate and a half on either side to be blended in with the wall and a half plate dividing line down the middle. Going into it, I knew for a fact that the door would have to be at least 2 studs deep, which was not ideal, but unless I wanted to create a messy, blocky exterior, it was necessary. That extra space was used up to make sure that the exterior was flush. I had to make a bit of a janky contraption for the dividing line, but it gets the job done. And at the same time, I extended the snot construction an extra stud up to avoid the gap at the top. Once I had the doors more or less sorted, I moved on to the livery. There have been approximately 0 liveries that the Siemens has looked good in, especially when it comes to the cab and train, but of course I had to make the PTV livery, which I did using large snot panels of angled tiles. In order to get the snot panels to attach, I had to once again borrow space from the interior. This was the first time I had made a train in PTV livery in a while, and with time comes new parts, in this case some new angled tiles that were useful beyond belief. With the first version of the livery, I'd shrunk down the door snot construction from 8 studs to 7, while still keeping the actual door bit mostly the same. The reason I could do this without fear of a gap was because the gigantic snot sections needed for the livery made it feasible, even ideal, to lower the top half of the train by half a plate. The door's shape did suffer somewhat, but I figured I could use stickers to rectify the issue, and is actually an indirect inspiration for some of my G-Classes stickers. Almost immediately after lowering the top half, I decided to do it again, reducing the snot panel from 4 studs high to 3. This further disfigured the doors, but it brought the whole train closer to looking right. I've been moving past it, but while experimenting with the livery, I was concurrently experimenting with the roof. Just about the only thing on the whole train that doesn't intersect at right angles is the edges of the roof, and instead it tapers off ever so slightly. I came up with what I think is a pretty neat looking transition from the wall to the roof, which has the tapered element made out of 2 colours. When I finally put 2 walls back to back to make an actual carriage, I went for a 9 stud wide base, as seen on many of my other mocks. The roof, however, is only 8 studs across, with the extra stud being made up by 2 half-stud indents needed to line up with the curved slopes. Each carriage has 2 aircon units roughly above the doors, and after a few iterations of varying sizes, I came up with a satisfactory design. Siemens roofs also have what I understand to be round vents, which I recreated simply with studs. The next step was to design the bogies. I came up with a mashup between my Extrapolis 100 and Comenge bogies to suit them for the Siemens. I'm on the fence about whether I like the way I've done the airbags, but I can't say that they don't work. The studs around them are slightly annoying, but there wasn't much I could easily do about them. At one point or another since I made it, Studio changed the way that one of the main parts that I used is orientated, so if any of the bogies look a bit off from here on out, that's why. I redesigned the doors yet again, and for this final version I used Bricklink Part Designer to add custom decals. There's probably a better way to do it, but this works, and it's how I did it when I was designing my G-Class. And so it was finally time for the cab. Surely it can't be that hard, you might be asking yourself, it's a brick train. Well, there are some complexities to the cab, much as I hate to admit there's anything complex about the Siemens. I had been pondering different ways to make the curve around the edges in the back of my mind for well over a year, so I had a decent base to start off of. The transition to the top portion, on the other hand, took a bit more thinking. Fortunately for me, the cab extends higher than the roof, so I didn't have to line it up with that, but I was still really struggling with it until I stumbled across an amazing new piece that was almost perfect in every way imaginable. These pieces not only had a cut end, which helped with the transition to the curved sides, but they also allowed me to somewhat cleanly round off the black area above the windscreen, a detail that was sorely missing in some older versions. Moving down, there's the windscreen. To be blunt, I hate it, but it's the best I could do in this situation. I would have loved to use just one piece, but as with the side windows, I could not. Because the train is 9 studs wide, and the cab is just as wide, I needed to make a windscreen 7 studs wide when factoring in the sides. I was hoping to simply use a 1x6x3 panel, like I had done on my Extrapolis 100, and then slide some tiles down the side to fill the gaps. But I quickly figured that that would not work. Instead, I used an absolute abomination of plates and tiles in a bid to make everything hold together. The whole construction is 3 plates deep, and to wishfully recreate the sides and top of the windscreen glass that isn't really a part of the windscreen, I put black plates 1 layer deep into it. These also help immensely structurally, and as a bonus, enabled me to put in headlights using studs. I would usually colour the headlights in trans clear, however, in this case it would blend in with the rest of the windscreen, so I coloured them in white instead, in the hopes that it would contrast more, and I think it turned out well. I slapped some mirrors on the side that used an extremely similar design to my Extrapolis 100, and like the Extrapolis, there's a driver's window obscured by it that you can barely make out if you're not looking for it. Further down the cab, I recreated the angled yellow stripe as seen on the PTV livery by outlining it with 2 sets of wedge plates offset by half a plate. I had to put a 1x1 in the middle, and even though I was annoyed by it initially, it worked out in the end, because without it, the top blue area would be a bit too pointy. Overall, I don't love the whole design, as there are a few studs showing, and the yellow stripe is indented on what is meant to be, for all intents and purposes, a flat surface, but I couldn't come up with any better alternatives. Before you all scream at me to put a tile sandwiched between some slopes, I couldn't put a snot section here because of the next problem I had to solve. Unfortunately for me, but a plus point to the lacking aesthetics of the Siemens, the cab is mildly angled, so I went about figuring out how on earth to do that cleanly. The subtlety of the angle created a whole host of problems, but I somehow managed to come up with an almost gapless method of integrating it with the rest of the body using the creative placement of some plates and brackets. For the actual angling part, I used a bank of hinges near the bottom, probably over-reinforcing it slightly, but you can never be too safe with Lego. These hinges are the reason that I couldn't have a snot section on the front. The hinges are too far forward and would collide with any snot pieces, were there to be any there. I might have been able to move the hinges around a bit to make the snot section work, but the cab was messy enough without that sort of modification. Towards the bottom of the cab, the yellow gives way to white. This part was much simpler compared to the upper part of the cab, since it's not angled. I was lucky that the real train has a ledge on this bit, since I happen to need to have one to make everything work. I unfortunately couldn't manage to fit the bottom headlights in cleanly around all of this, but in a weird way the studs on the wedge plates sort of make up for that. A detail that annoyed me for a fairly innocuous reason is where the frame goes between the upper and lower parts of the cab. It looks wrong, which makes me feel like I've been lazy here, where instead it was a happy accident that improved the structural rigidity of the design. One small detail that I did miss around it though is the small diagonal cut in the yellow around the corner, but adding that in could introduce a whole host of problems that I'd rather not think about. This was the first train that I had designed with my Scharfenberg coupler design, and compared to the old tow balls that I was using, it's like night and day. Going back to the top of the cab, I attempted to add the horn-like things and clean up the back. However, after many hours of trial and error, this was the best I could manage, and I could not come up with anything that worked well for the horns. With the M car comes the pantograph, and to make it, I employed the age-old technique of using a tried-and-true design, slapping a few extra bricks around it, and calling it a day. Now that most of the major details were done on both the M and T cars, all I really had left to do was the undercarriage. After scouting it out, I was somewhat surprised to find that it was almost entirely smaller boxes under the big box. There were a few exceptions that I did my best to capture, but this has as much detail as I could reasonably put in. You can't make this stuff up. One of the last major modifications I made before I considered it done was reducing the size of the aircon units, a decision spurred on by the ugly overhang that the old design had over the slopes. I originally tried to rectify the problem in a different way, using flat slopes in place of the curved ones, which is something I wanted to do right from the beginning because I thought they looked more accurate, but quickly found to be impractical because they were unable to be attached in the way I wanted them to be. I did come up with a band-aid solution using 2x2 hinge plates. These hinge plates come to an approximately quarter plate thick end, which reduced the amount that the roof would have been lifted up by compared to alternatives, but it was still too much for my liking and made attaching the roof to the rest of the train somewhat laborious, so I scrapped it. With that, I had finished it, coming in at a nice round 4,200 pieces exactly. It's one of my favourite trains. Hold on, let me rephrase that. Favourite mocks. The real thing still sucks. A few days after originally deeming it complete, I went back to design a quick and dirty articulation for it, as that was a detail it was sorely lacking. It's nothing special, and for the time being absolutely does not work, however I might try to make a functional design in the future. Getting the tiles to be a half plate offset from each other was a fun little challenge, however small and insignificant of a detail it is. As stated at the beginning of the video, the Siemens completes my designed collection of mid-2010 suburban rolling stock. So, including my Extrapolis 2.0, all I've really got left to design in terms of electric suburban rolling stock is the swing door, Tate, original Harris, Hitachi, and HCMT. Not to give too big of a spoiler, but I've already finished one of these, and I'm deep into work on another one. You might also point out that I need to design all of the Comage variants, but I'm well ahead of you there. If you've made it this far into the video, why not consider subscribing or even become a member? If you do, you'll get early access to videos and sneak peeks on everything I've just mentioned, and more. Huge thanks to Jay for your support. And with that, thanks for watching, see you next time.